Continuing with the 1950s, this video will go over the baseball legends that were inducted in the latter half of the decade. And I'm sure while you guys have sat through this series, there's more than enough guys that you knew absolutely nothing about, but I promise, as time goes on in this series, you'll start to recognize more and more names. Heck, the first guy I'm going to talk about in the 1955 class is a guy that was very famous in American culture for 3 decades. Before I reveal who that guy is, I should note that 1954 was the first year the BBWAA adopted the rule where players had to be retired for 5 full seasons to be eligible, and this is a rule that still stands today. With that out of the way, the 1955 class featured a large group of guys, which included Joe DiMaggio, Ted Lyons, Dazzy Vance, and Gabby Hartnett from the writers' ballots, and featured Frank Baker and Ray Schalk from the Veterans Committee. Joe DiMaggio lived a very large life while he was around, with both his baseball career and his relationship with Marilyn Monroe during the 50s, but for now, I want to mostly focus on what he did as an athlete. For those who don't know, DiMaggio was a legendary center fielder who spent his entire career with the Yankees during the 30s and 40s, and he received 88.8% support this year from the writers. He joined the Yankees in 1936 when he was just 21, and his legendary career took off from there, where he hit 300 in every season from 1936 to 42 before leaving baseball for a few years to serve his country in the Air Force. He came back with the Bronx Bombers from 1946 to 51, where he continued to hit just as well as ever. This all led to Joltin' Joe being named an AL All-Star in every single season he played in, 3 AL MVP awards, 2 batting titles, 9 World Series championships, and recording the longest hitting streak in baseball history of 56 games that's unlikely to ever be topped. DiMaggio was described by his teammates and peers as having an aura about him, the best player that ever lived, and the greatest all-around player I ever saw. The impact he had on baseball during these times is something that can never be taken away from him. The next guy from this class is Ted Lyons, a pitcher who spent 21 years in the majors with the White Sox as one of the most reliable arms of his time. He got 86.5% of votes in 1955, and the right-hander had actually planned on going to law school before he decided to play baseball professionally. As a fastball-only pitcher when he started, he led the AL in wins twice, as well as complete games and innings pitched twice, and injuries forced him to add a breaking ball and even a knuckleball to his arsenal. Doing that allowed him to continue to pitch for much longer, and similar to Joe DiMaggio, he stepped away from baseball for 3 years to serve his country in World War II. Lyons came back to baseball in 1946, where he'd play for 1 more season along with being named White Sox manager the same year. Ted finished his career with a 260-230 record, a 3.67 ERA, and whenever he pitched on Sundays, it was certain that he was going to end the game with a victory. The next pitcher here is Dazzy Vance, who was a guy who didn't come into his own in the majors until he was 31 years old. The righty spent most of his time with the Brooklyn Robins in the 1920s and got 81.7% of votes in 1955. Vance first appeared in the majors in 1915 with the Pirates, but would always find himself stuck with arm injuries in his 20s. But 1922 is when he finally broke out. During his time in Brooklyn, he led the NL in wins twice, ERA 3 times, and gained a reputation as a strikeout wizard, leading in strikeouts in 7 straight seasons. Dazzy also won the NL Triple Crown in 1924 and beat out Rogers Hornsby's .424 season to win NL MVP. After winning the World Series with the Cardinals in 1934, he came back to Brooklyn the next year as a reliever before calling it quits. He finished with 197 wins, a .324 ERA, 2,045 strikeouts, and is remembered as being one of the most dominant starting pitchers in the 1920s. The last BBWAA inductee this year was Gabby Hartnett, who was a mainstay with the Cubs for almost 20 years as a catcher. He received 77.7% of votes this year and was always feared for both his bat and his defense behind home plate. Gabby made his debut for the Cubs in 1922 and became known as one of the best hitters in baseball just a couple years later. He hit 300 with Chicago for 5 seasons, was selected to 6 NL All-Star teams, and drove in 80 or more runs 6 times. His MVP season was in 1935, where he hit 344 with 91 RBI en route to leading the Cubs to the NL pennant, which was one of 4 the Cubs won during his tenure. Hartnett would then spend one last year with the Giants in 1941 before retiring. His stats included a .297 career average, 1,179 RBI, and was dubbed by Hall of Fame manager Joe McCarthy as, quote, the perfect catcher. He was super smart and nobody could throw like him. And he was also an outstanding clutch hitter. The first of 2 Veterans Committee inductees this year was Frank Baker, or as they would call him when he played, Home Run Baker. And before you run the baseball reference and tell me, Ryan, this guy only hit 96 homers in his career, what are you talking about? You've got to remember that this guy played in the dead ball era where hitting 10 to 15 home runs in a season was considered the same as someone like Aaron Judge hitting 50 to 60 homers nowadays. Anyway, Baker was a third baseman who split his career between the Athletics and Yankees, and he always used a heavy 46-ounce bat. He used said bat to hit 306 seasons, drive in 100 or more runs 3 times, and lead the AL in home runs 4 times. Baker also won 3 World Series with the A's and got sold off after, you know, the 1914 World Series. I feel like I'm saying this about so many players. Anyway, he was sold to the Yankees and actually refused to play with them before joining in 1916, and he'd play well with them up until his retirement in 1922. Baker finished with a .307 average, 1,838 hits, and gained a reputation as one of the game's first big home run hitters, even if the stats don't suggest that anymore. Ray Schalk is the final inductee from the 1955 class, and he was a catcher who was a stalwart for the White Sox for over 15 years. He's another guy who never had any eye-popping stats on offense, but his defense is what kept him in Chicago for so long. He made his big league debut when he was 19, and over time became a master at knowing how to catch his pitchers properly, and rarely ever made an error or failed to throw out a would-be base stealer. Schalk won the World Series with the White Sox in 1917 and was never accused of doing anything wrong during the 1919 World Series, which is where the Black Sox scandal came from. Even though he retired in 1929 with just a .253 average, he consistently caught over 100 games per season and became known as probably the most reliable defensive catcher of his time. In contrast to the class I just finished talking about, the writers in 1956 only elected 2 new guys, and they were Hank Greenberg and Joe Cronin, who were some of the best to ever play at their position. These 2 were also the last inductees in the decade that were elected by the writers. Hank Greenberg was one of the game's premier first basemen when he played in the 30s and 40s, and this included him missing 3 full seasons because of military service. He spent all but the last year of his career with the Tigers and received 85% of votes from the BBWAA. As the first great Jewish player in MLB, Greenberg was initially offered a contract with his hometown Yankees when first entering the big leagues, but chose to sign with Detroit instead, and that paved the way for him to become one of the most dominant hitters of his time. His accolades consist of 5 AL All-Star selections, 2 AL MVP awards, and being part of 2 World Series winning teams with the Tigers. He took time off from 1942 to 44 to serve his country in the ongoing war and came back in 1945 without missing a beat. Hank played one last season with the Pirates in 1947 before walking away from the game for good. His career stats include a .313 average, 331 home runs, 379 doubles, 7 seasons of 100 or more RBI, and leading the AL in home runs 4 times. One of his contemporaries, Joe DiMaggio, once said of Hank, quote, "He was truly one of the great hitters, and when I saw him in his first at-bat, he made my eyes pop out." The other inductee from the 1956 class was Joe Cronin, who was a shortstop who mostly played for the Boston Red Sox and Washington Senators. Cronin got 78.8% support that year and started with the Pirates when he was only 19 before getting sold to the Senators in 1928. He came into his own in 1930 when he hit .346 with 126 RBI, leading to the only AL MVP award of his career. He reached the .300 mark for 3 more seasons in Washington before getting traded to Boston in October 1934. As a Red Sox, Joe hit exactly .300 during his time there, and as he got older, saw the field less and eventually became a full-time manager in Boston after 1946. He'd go on to become the president of the American League and was responsible for expanding the AL from 8 teams to 12, and the new teams founded were the Los Angeles Angels, Washington Senators, Kansas City Royals, and Seattle Pilots, which relocated to Milwaukee after 1 season and renamed as the Brewers. As for what he did on the field, Cronin finished with a lifetime .301 average, 2,285 hits, 1,424 RBI, 7 AL All-Star appearances, and was always one of the best shortstops in the game, both at bat and with his glove. Just like the class of '56, this Hall of Fame group consisted of only 2 guys, but these 2 came from the Veterans Committee. They were outfielder Sam Crawford and manager Joe McCarthy, 2 of the best to ever do it at their positions. Even though he was never the best player in his own outfield while he played in Detroit, Sam Crawford was still one of the best hitters in the league, and he always drove the ball well into the gaps. Crawford was a right fielder who spent his career in Cincinnati and Detroit, and he instantly made an impact as a 19-year-old rookie. He hit .313 in 3 full seasons with the Reds before going to Detroit in 1903, forming a deadly outfield duo of him and Ty Cobb while doing so. While with the Tigers, he collected 100 RBI in 5 different years and was always known for hitting for a high average. Wahoo Sam, as he was nicknamed, also helped Detroit to 3 AL pennants, but struggled in each series, which might have contributed to their 3 World Series losses. That shouldn't take away from how good a hitter he was, however, and he finished his career with a .309 average, 2,961 hits, and is MLB's all-time triples leader with 309. His philosophy to hitting was to simply not overthink it, saying, quote, "My idea of batting is a thing that should be done unconsciously. If you get to studying it too much, you will miss it altogether." Joe McCarthy is the other inductee from the 1957 class, and he was the manager of the Yankees empire from 1931 to 46 that saw 8 trips to the World Series during his tenure. After failing to make it to the majors as a player, he eventually got named manager of the Cubs in 1926, taking them from the basement of the National League to a winner every year, and he took them to the 1929 World Series, where they'd fall short against Connie Mack and the Athletics. He wasn't brought back after the 1930 season, and the Yankees picked him up for the 1931 season, and he won 100 games on 6 occasions with the Bronx Bombers. All he did with them was win, whether it was with Ruth, Gehrig, or DiMaggio, and this winning resulted in 7 World Series titles, tied for the most ever by a manager. After leaving the Yankees, he'd managed the Red Sox for a few years before officially calling it quits in 1950. When he managed, he never demanded any attention during the game, and was always someone that anybody could learn from. After the BBWAA met and failed to elect anybody to the Hall in 1958, the Veterans Committee met in 1959 and they elected only one guy, and that was an outfielder named Zack Wheat. Wheat was a left fielder who spent all but the last year of his career with the Brooklyn Dodgers and Robins during the 1910s and 1920s. As one of the most beloved players in the league by fans and his peers, he became a full-time player in Brooklyn at 22 years old in 1910, and became known as one of the best pure hitters of his time, hitting over 312 different full seasons, and that included a batting title in 1918. These also included 3 seasons of 200 or more hits, all of which came in his mid to late 30s. Wheat also won 2 NL pennants with Brooklyn in 1916 and 1920, and his career ended in 1927 with a .317 average, 2,884 hits, and Hall of Fame manager Casey Stengel once spoke of Wheat as, quote, "the only great ball player who never got booed."